From the News Channel 5 Network, this is Morning Line with Nick Barris.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on Morning Line. I'm, of course, Nick Barris. I hope you had a very pleasant weekend. Boy, I'll tell you, the weather this past weekend was just brilliant, wasn't it? Brace yourself. It kind of set us up for what we're going to have the rest of this week. Starting today, it's going to be awful hot. So if you're in and about, join us on the program this morning. The number is 737-7987. And you're welcome to join in the conversation as we talk about what is a federal holiday today. I think officially it was yesterday, Juneteenth, okay? But today is the observance of the federal holiday, as many of the federal offices, government agencies will be closed. And I want to get into the significance of it, okay? What it meant to the end of slavery, what it means to society as a whole, to African Americans, and to all of us this morning. And we'll get into some of that. We can take some questions and observations from you if you'd like, but we have a wonderful guest this morning to talk about this, kind of give us more of the background on it and what it really does mean. Tiffany Patterson's with us. She's an associate professor of African American Studies at Vanderbilt. It's very nice to have you on this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming on. And today is the federal holiday, and we were talking before the show about the observance of this day. It's only recently become a federal holiday. Of course, we all know it dates back to 1865, the significance of it, but to become more mainstream, even for someone like yourself, with your background, you were telling me about your father and all of this. When did it become something that you became very aware of?
As I was telling you, I was born in the South, in Mississippi, but I didn't grow up there. My parents migrated right after the war. They migrated north.
World War II.
World War II.
Yeah.
Not right after, but they came. My mother was not going to stay in the South for a lot of obvious reasons. So in a few years, they migrated north to Gary, Indiana, right outside of Chicago.
Sure.
There were other relatives living in Chicago. And so as I grew up, primarily initially in an all-black neighborhood as a small child, and then when civil rights desegregated the North, and that's important to underscore, I have to with my students, the segregation in America was almost total. Neighborhoods were segregated in the North as well. And so in those communities, as I became a teenager, I began to hear this word Juneteenth. I wasn't always sure what it was. Sometimes I think there were things at our church that was about Juneteenth, but it wasn't a big issue. There were the people there were from, for the most part, migrants from the South, and they brought the knowledge of it with them, but it was never explained to me.
And it was never really in, because I'm trying to think back to me, and I remember what you're talking about, segregation, and I remember desegregation. I grew up in a suburb of Chicago, not far from Gary, actually, but just the idea of what was being taught in schools at the time, and we've heard this with a lot of our American history, some things have been glossed over. Well, that was not really, but this was a historical significant date, June 19th, 1865, wasn't it?
Yes, as we know now.
As we know now, and it's interesting that it just wasn't played up back, at least in school, for us.
I never heard it in one
Me either.
class.
Me either.
I went to school first at Indiana University's local campus. In my American history class, not a word. I must point out, too, very little about slavery also. I go to graduate school in Illinois in American history. I learned more about abolition. There was a key scholar there that I took courses with, Dr. Betty Flaidland. So I heard all about abolition, never heard anything about Juneteenth. Juneteenth became, in the last 20 years or so, 10, 20 years, discussed a lot more. Particularly, I moved here 15 years ago, and living here, I would hear more of it, or hear about it, so to speak. But it was never played up except among African Americans, and not all African Americans. The connection to the South was very important for those who did say something about it. That this is when we celebrate our emancipation. But it was interesting to me that none of my professors mentioned it.
Yeah. It's like, as I remember thinking back when I was younger and hearing about the Civil War and understanding the Emancipation Proclamation, I thought to myself, okay, so the president, Lincoln, has said such. But who's enforcing this? And what about the Deep South? All right, you can say the Emancipation Proclamation. You can say the war was over. General Lee surrendered. Okay, but now slaves are supposed to be freed. And there's the proclamation. And I would think to myself, I never got an answer. Well, who told the slaves? Who told the slaves in the Deep South? I mean, you know, is someone going to enforce this? And not until Juneteenth really came to, you know, the forefront for me did I realize, all right, someone had to enforce it. Okay, Texas. Let's just talk about Juneteenth that day, and we'll talk more about the background. So, the Emancipation Proclamation, the idea of slaves to be freed, it came well before June 19th, 1865. The issue was in the Deep South, in places like Texas, the slave owners were not telling the slaves, and they kept them.
No, because they could get more labor out of them.
Right, that's what they were thinking. So until it could be enforced. So what ultimately happened then? A general had to come down from the Union.
Yes, General Gordon Granger came down, issued an order, I believe it's called Order Number 3, enforcing the Emancipation Proclamation, which had been signed by Lincoln 2 years earlier in 1863. And then they learned that they were free. And of course, the news got, so to speak, got out, you know, and had been hidden from a good many people. The evidence suggests that there was resistance, certainly from some quote-unquote owners, of letting their slaves go.
Sure.
But it was a federal law. And as we know, and we dig into American history, we know that what took its place was a structure of apartheid, for all intent and purposes, in the South, where many of the former slaves continued to work for, at very meager wages, for their former owners or other owners. Those who became free, one of the things that was supposed to happen and didn't happen is what we're discussing today, reparations. And the reparations can be captured in the term 40 acres and a mule of getting land. They were not given land. In my family, both my grandfathers managed to buy land. And so we still own that land in Mississippi on my mother's side of the family. And so, but they were not given any land.
They weren't. They had, but that's what I was thinking. Tangibly speaking, it's one thing to have the celebration when they learned that they were free, but it's another thing to say, okay, what do we do now? These are slaves who, until this point, were just working at a plantation and everything, they were told to do everything, and they were very limited, and all of a sudden they have the freedom. It's not as simple as just saying, okay, I'm free, I'm going to go get a job and buy a house. I mean, that's the trick. I mean, and you're right, there was apartheid where they maybe had no choice, they didn't know what to do. They'd stay, and now the slave owners would pay them a pittance to stay on because maybe they knew nothing else.
In fact, this is the beginning of the emergence of sharecropping, and which was a horrible system for blacks and some whites, poor whites, who were caught up in that as well. So what you have is an attempt to hang on to cheap labor by those who owned the land. And the resistance to that, and there was a resistance by as many African Americans who could. To read the documents that are now housed at the Library of Congress, we get a real sense now, we know a great deal about slavery, how awful slavery was for African people, how gendered it was, a particular kind of oppression for women, a different kind of oppression for men. It's coming out, and as you, as a newsman really knows, there's this real backlash from many whites in the country. They do not want to talk about slavery.
We're going to take a break on that note because that segues to where we are here, and I think Juneteenth is a flashpoint for that, for better or for worse, and that conversation and what you feel needs to be said and what should be taught. And as I said, we can take some phone calls or you can sit back and listen. Tiffany Patterson, it's a pleasure to have her on. We're going to continue our conversation, pick up where we left off on this backlash and what Juneteenth represents. More right after this. Stay with us.